Hi, my name is Benedict for Higher Hertz. In this video, we're looking at Anna, the second version, number 2, by Sonic Academy. The version that I have is via Slate. As if you're watching, you'll realize that I'm running through a Slate thing on a Slate binge, whilst I have access to the 1 month trial thing. Anna has been on the list. So it's kind of good timing that the pair marry up. Now, Anna is an interesting synth. I felt a little when I first started with it, and I still am prone to finding the interface a little that way. Not quite sure why, to be perfectly honest. But within a relatively short period of time of using it, I realised that this was one of a brand of synthesizers in which I feel like I could make albums worth of material with just the one instrument. There are a lot of instruments and devices which you sort of feel like, oh yeah, that's a bit clever and I'd use that from time to time. Then there are those that, as I've said several times, you kind of just want to marry. Anna could well be one of those. Like if this was the thing that I had and I didn't have other things that were similar, then I could say that is a path that I would fully commit to and go right on down. There are some limits, some things that I kind of wonder why it doesn't do them, but the fact that it doesn't is not the end of the line at all, because overall, while there are some things that I sort of feel like, yeah, that possibly could be different, it does things elegantly, and there overall has been some nice care and thought put into things, and I kind of get the feeling that there was more emphasis on how it sounds and how it feels than on simply ticking a whole pile of extra boxes to list things on the website for sale. So, quick sense of how it might sound on its own. That's a preset pretty randomly. Yes, it's got that whole big virtual analog synth thing happening, and happening pretty well in spades. As to where it comes from, Sonic Academy are the people behind it. Anna came out and managed to not make much of a splash at all. There was the usual stuff in the marketing about how pro it is and how amazing pros are using it, blah, 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 blah. But for some reason it didn't get chatter. It just went silent, and then number 2 came out, and they tried for the same thing, but to be perfectly honest, there still seemed to be kind of no chatter. There were some people who were going, wow, this is amazing, and plenty of people who are going, wow, that's just a fizz. I think that both are based on personal perceptions, which is absolutely fine because we're all going to give our personal perception. There are some things that I can see why people may find that they struggle to get their head around it. As I said, I initially was struggling not to get my head around the architecture, but around feeling like I could actually understand what was going on, which for someone 30 years on and a synthesist at heart made me wonder what's happening here. But I think I've gotten used to whatever that was a lot more. So you can go and look at Sonic Academy, but I ended up getting it through, as I've said, the Slate thing. By trying the all-access pass, you get access to it. The Slate thing does add a few more doohickeys, some of which we will look at, and one of which might solve a possible problem some people may have. So, big synth. You can resize to some extent, but they are preset sizes. It's probably reasonably sized, but at the same time, I feel like on a 1080 screen, a lot of things just come up seeming small. And that possibly is part of the difficulty, but at the same time, at 125%, I still felt like, as I looked at it, somehow I couldn't get a sense of its flow. I looked at different GUI colors, and while I get that some people would like the black thing, I actually find it harder on my ability to grok the device, to encompass it in one go, than otherwise. This, again, I just feel like it's doing this to me, and maybe that's just an Aspie thing, but it shouldn't. Not everything does this to me. That one, again, it's kind of nice, but it just doesn't feel to me like it really nails things. I won't run through all of them. And then there's this one, which is actually rather interesting. So if you are finding the same thing that I do, that you look at this thing and you feel like your eyes and your brain just go everywhere, and you're struggling to get a sense of what the modules are and where the modules are, and then how they might relate to each other. How they relate to each other, there is no real indication on this interface, and I think that's possibly what does it for me, the fact that there isn't a sense of flow in how things are put together. There kind of is, but there kind of isn't. There's no sense of what's the routing here. But this version, it looks like garbage. But it does also make your separate modules very, very clear from each other. So if you're looking at the white interface or any of the other color interfaces and feeling a bit like I'm just going everywhere all at once with my understanding, possibly consider using this Eurorack version until you can get a sense of how this thing flows. I have stayed with the white because overall I like white interfaces because they are clean and they are clear. Just the sense of somehow bringing it together as a unit is difficult. It's also made a little bit more difficult by the way some of the modulation is handled. It's elegant enough in its own thinking on the surface, but in practice it becomes confusing. I like having a mod matrix on display. This VST style approach to lots of different windows, and some of them contextual windows that pop out from strange different places, is not one that has ever appealed to me. It didn't appeal to me much when I was completely in the VST sphere, but after having spent a lot of time in the Reason world, where a comparable synth like Europa managed to handle really essentially a one-for-one kind of architecture as this, without having strange things pop out of unusual locations. Like we can pop up windows here, but not there, and it makes sense in its own way, but then it also creates confusion in others. So up to you which way you approach it, but I do feel like it needs an unnecessary amount of time to understand the bits that seem to have been kind of tacked on, which is a shame. Back to the positive in the sense that it is a very nice synth that sounds and feels very nice and is capable of a lot of versatility. Let's for a moment just pop this wee fellow aside and we will run over those goods and bads, which is that it's got a tremendous sound and character, which we haven't gotten into yet, but that's really more for you to play with and work out as you go. The filter models are lovely. Whether they are the best, perfectest filter models, I never know and I never care. But when I move from Model A to Model B to Model C to Model D, do I feel like I'm getting something different? Yes, I most definitely do. And they feel like they have unique characters. And that's great. I'm not looking to go, does this VCS sound exactly like a VCS? Because it's not going to. You know, it just isn't. The only way to sound like a VCS is to get a VCS. And then if you want to sound like the VCS in Dark Side of the Moon, you've got to have all the same sort of gear they had, but most importantly, you've got to have the same thinking process that they had. Otherwise, the way you use your VCS is going to be of today. So, nice models, really good. Overall, there are a lot of options. So, as I've said again, bottom line, some of the highest praise that I can give an instrument is that I feel like I could make many albums with just this instrument alone. Very nice. Bad, as I've said, the GUI, for some reason, it just feels hard to encompass the thing, to see it as a single functioning interconnected instrument. I look at it and I feel like my brain just goes, there, rather than together. It's a thing that you do come together with. The other negative that I felt, and I sort of wonder why, but it's not a killer, was that there doesn't seem to be any connectivity between the straight VA type oscillators and the samples. So it'd be kind of nice if there was some way to have them connect with each other. They don't FM to each other or whatever, and maybe I'm missing this. Maybe I just haven't found it looked hard enough. But they feel like they're rather, you can do this and you can do this and you can layer them, which is a kind of interconnectedness. But there doesn't seem to be a way to use them to perhaps modulate or do stuff to each other. And I kind of wonder why not, because there's been so much thought put into other things that makes it work nicely and even solve problems that will come up quite elegantly. Only two real negatives. I tried to rack my brain but didn't come up with much more. Bottom line, I think that if you are looking for the one instrument, then this conceivably is well worth looking at it. If you don't have a strong instrument set or haven't found an instrument that you want to settle with and have decided to go down the Slate path, then don't dismiss Anna because it's been bundled. If you're looking at the other thing that's bundled, which is Phase Plant, which I reviewed not so long ago, great big review there, but find it a little head exploding, which I do understand. I made a whole album with Phase Plant and really came to see a lot that's positive, but Anna, the fact that everything's already there, you don't have to wire stuff together as much, makes it a very attractive synth. Don't dismiss it because it's been bundled. It's a very, very good synth that if I weren't so embedded with something like Europa in Within Reason, which is, as I said, almost a one-for-one in terms of basic feature set, then I could be like, ooh, So it's a good bit of kit. So let's have a quick look at architecture more specifically. We have 3 oscillators. They are of the wavetable type. So that's the serum type thing, in that you can move them through various different types of modes. There are a lot of oscillator forms in here and various ways of looking at them. I don't particularly dig that version, but other people might. So you've got the factory banks, user banks, and then other banks. So the factory banks, you will start with your basic waves, which are just pure DSP generated waves. And so they don't really have wavetable functionality. You've then got your other ones which morph and change. So that's more of your serum style wavetable, which can morph from one thing to another. Often they are shown in that waterfall display, the Joy Division t-shirt shape, but this is far more practical in many ways, not as pretty, but moves you through the shape. And the pulse width, actually just changing the length of the wave. I'm not sure whether that's literally a pulse width, don't care, don't want to argue about it. It sounds like a pulse width, and it works like one. And then you can put it into a sync mode, which will cause it to whine. There is, before I go much further, an initialize patch. Yay! It's there, and it's also inside menus and stuff. So we can go through our basic forms and then get into the other forms. So as I said, it doesn't really matter whether the display is not showing what's really happening. It does sound like a pulse width, and most of the time it behaves very much that way. There are 3 of these. These are all essentially the same, but you will see that source for FM changes. You can't become circular feedback FM on itself. Understandable in the digital world, because that creates some serious issues upon which basically the software will crash. To go around that, you then need to get into some very, very scary math, or to put latency, which means that by the time you have sent your signal back on itself with latency, it's no longer a proper feedback. It starts to create a different kind of wave, normally a nasty one. So its omission is perfectly understandable in trying to keep the synth sounding nice, because a synth does major in sounding nice. That's not to say you can't do paint stripper sounds out of it. It's just, it's got that smoothed off, nice feel. I don't know where that comes from, whether that's how they band limit, or whether it's oversampling, I don't know, but it does sound nice. It has this ability to always sound smooth, which can be good, can be bad. But if we're on oscillator 1, we can actually FM from oscillator 2 or oscillator 3, and that changes as we go through the different oscillators. Voices, we can choose from 0 voices, which oddly enough does nothing, to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 9 instances of itself, which can be detuned and widened. And that always manages to sound nice, which is great. I'm not big on the detune thing, but when it sounds nice, it's a useful sort of a thing. I also found that using FM and multi-voices and detuned behaved nicely. Commonly enough, it can start to sound really ugly really fast. This behaved nicely, so if they've got some kind of smoothing system, it's working. Just understand that smoothing system will mean that it limits some of your options in other directions, but generally their decisions seem to be very, very pleasing ones. You can also get into shaping stuff, which quite honestly I didn't encounter what it did, didn't go looking for it. Octave, only ±3, and I kind of wonder at that, but maybe they're trying to avoid people getting too much into aliasing things. Semitones, fine. Velocity, so you can control how something responds to velocity right here, which is kind of cool. Morph velocity, so morphing can happen as a result of velocity as well. Hardwired things, kind of cool. You can also change how it responds to key, but only up to 100%. You can't go past 100%, but it's very rare that you use beyond 100%. The main situations you'll have are 0, 100, and maybe a little something in between for a special effect kind of thing. We've covered those. You can dial in a sub. Never a fan of subs, but it's there. You can obviously pan each oscillator. That's cool. Oh, I do hear diagonals as I'm moving that, but I don't think that happens when it's being modulated. You can assign where this oscillator goes. You can mean that it goes to no filters, which is what the little X means. If you are concerned about what something means, if you look up here, the little info window will actually be giving you a tooltip. Kind of cool. You can go to filter 1 or to filter 2. Let's just close that down. So you can be sending this oscillator. Let's just do filter 1 or filter 2 or to none, and then you can change the level. When doing FM, if we choose this and we give it one voice, it has to have a voice. If we turn that down, go back over here. No, I'll turn that one down. Then back to on 1. But you notice how you have to go backwards and forwards, and you have to carry some things in your head. And all synthesis requires carrying a certain amount of stuff in your head. Is this a good solution or a bad solution? It's not my favorite solution, but I think it does work once you understand how you carry things in your head and where they're assigning themselves. So as you hear, you can get nasty FM, but it does it in that nice, smoothed off, nasty FM way that people seem to really like. I can get rid of that as simply as just going 0, and the FM won't do anything because there's nothing being sent to it. Oh, oscillators. We've then got a second trio of oscillators, 4, 5, and 6, which are sample oscillators. We can choose our waveforms again through finding particular sounds. So if we get rid of this one for the moment, there's a certain amount of stuff you can do. You can clear your sample, you can set them to re-trigger, which means every time you press a key it starts again, but in this it seems to do that anyway. You can do your same moving plus minus 3 octaves, semitones, what have you, velocity, key. You've also got a high pass. It's not too uncommon when you put samples in that they might have too much kludge. If you just want to clarify it and say, look, I don't want the bottom end, I only want the top end, you can clarify that. So nice. It would be kind of nice if there was a top one as well, but it minimizes your need for a filter sort of unnecessarily. You can change your start point, change where your loops happen, any crossfading that's happening, panning, filter assigning, and of course volume. So you've got 3 of those, but they don't interact with either each other or this as far as I can see. Let me just check this as a source. No, you don't have a million sources and destinations. They are a little limited. So we don't have the ability particularly to FM or cross-modulate things through the modern matrix. That, over time, would annoy me a bit. But if you've got this through Slate and you want to get into that world of ugliness, then, or interestingness, then it can definitely be done in Phase Plant. It's just a thing, but it's not a killer. You would be more creating your core sound and then adding in a sample form, or having your sample thing and then adding in some oscillatory stuff. One or the other, it's a layering option more than anything else. So you can have your and add something in. The most common uses will be to add attacks for things. Punch. What do we got? Oh, I probably messed that one up. So if we turn that off. Oh, I don't know. There are punchy sounds, I've seen them. But looking for things is a bit... you got to get used to it. Ah, the old... that sound. So we can... we might want to pop that back up to key follow. So they're your oscillator forms. We send 2 filters. Might turn that velocity off as well. Them kind of even with each other. This one took me a little bit. You've got a master filter control and then the filter control. For now, I'm just going to turn that down. Your filters default to none, so you're going to want to choose something. We'll choose the first one, Rolly. Rolliand, obviously. Meant to be Roland-like. Resonance filters, all of that, again, have this really nice sort of smooth feeling. To be honest, it's more of a VA smooth than a real analog smooth, but who cares? It sounds nice. But we can also then override and control our filters from here. So basically, you're going to want to decide where you control it from. It does mean that you can set one filter either going to the second filter, let's say different levels like this, and then control them together with this. So it's not a bad thing to have by any stretch of the imagination. You can also run in parallel, so we could send this oscillator to filter 1, this oscillator to filter 2, and have them kind of running a little bit like separate synths, because you've then got lots of envelopes to do that, which we'll get to as we get there. But we'll go series, and then envelope. We've got a dedicated filter envelope here. And they do sound nice. You can run through all the different versions. Oogies, Borg-like. And that's nice. It's got a nice kind of throw to its sound. I do think that's really nice. The VCS, which is a very, very nice sounding filter. I'm super impressed with the filters and the feel of them. So often I go through instruments and they say, oh, we've got these 27 different filter models. It's like, okay, they all sound exactly the same as each other. The obies are nice. Everything in here is nice. And then they've got generic ones, which are really resonant-y. They probably should have just called them TBs or something. Valve filters. And then other, which kind of almost started again. Phase filters. Two poles saturated. So they're not so specifically modeled on anything. They're digital, but they do the thing nicely. So the shapes are good. There are lots of them. Chances are you're going to find something interesting in them just by flipping from one to another, if nothing else. Let's stay with Korg. Not because it's my fave, but I do like it. I think it's a good all-rounder. So as I said before, we can push into filter 2 or we can run the pair of them beside each other. You've got all these envelopes. Your filter envelope, which is obviously hardwired to your filter. You've got amp envelope. They feel like they're awfully slow and snappy, or too fast and snappy here, and then they go out to 60 seconds, which is long, which is great. Like if you want to do real paddy kind of stuff, that's nice. But this part of the slider becomes less detailed than this part of the slider. One of those situations where I wouldn't mind a little button that says, do you want to weight us this way for really fast sounds, or do you want to weight it that way for slow sounds? But either way is perfectly workable. They're nice envelopes and, again, have different kinds of shapings to them, and you can get into how the curves operate, as in how they travel. If you mismatch the envelope types to each other, you may find that they don't operate as nicely together. However, there are cases where you might say, I want this envelope to operate this way and I want that one to operate that way. But if you feel like they're not kind of gelling, just make sure they're the same type. Otherwise, you can find them mismatch. You've got mod envelope, which is a freely assignable, and you've got 4 of them. You kind of have to really watch to make sure which one is lit up. While there is a light, it somehow doesn't always feel as clear, so make sure that before you go altering things, you have got the right one selected. Each one of these can have its own assignments of everything. So 2 hardwired, 4 assignable, we're getting a lot of modulation options, and then the G envelope, which is a kind of MSEG. And we can assign our MSEGs 2 things. Let's say we want to assign it to filter, right click, find our G envelope 1, and we're good to go. That will also appear in the mod matrix. Not too hard, but not my preferred, simply because I can't see that matrix. But it does work, and it works elegantly enough without any particular trauma once you get used to it. You can also click this and pop right out and start changing our forms and get up into a kind of FM type territory. You can sync to BPM, but you probably all know my opinion on that. You can also set your destination from here, and it gives you pretty broad access to quite a lot of things. So overall, Oh, you can save off these things as well. Overall, I think 3 of those, coupled with 4 of those, 7 assignable envelopes, these being able to work as LFOs is really good. Speaking of LFOs, we have 3 LFOs here as well. So 3 LFOs, 3 assignable envelope types. It is very well set up for modulation stuff. LFOs are pretty well as expected. Let's pull this down to, we can assign, let's assign actually our first one to pitch fine. We've now got a vibrato. Building a very, very nice sound. You've got macros, which means you can assign various things to one knob. Shouldn't need to go over that. You've got EQ, which has got a sort of a simple mode on the front, and then an edit mode where you can get into the draggy thing, but the draggy thing doesn't actually turn it on. You have to turn it on here. Oh, one thing, if you do use that Euro rack mode, there is a bug that when the EQ says it's on, it's off. Its button is backwards. Well done, guys. It's an alright EQ, and it can really help set up a sound. Just understand at this point, if you over EQ, you might make it hard to mix. So don't make mixed decisions early on with your EQ. Make sound decisions, but don't make mixed decisions, because they are for the mix. Otherwise, you might end up pushing your sound into an area which makes it very hard to mix, and then you probably won't want to sacrifice the sound. If it comes to it, you get into the mix and you go, look, it's just too bright. Come back here and fix that. So EQ, quite functional. And then we get into effects. I don't love the effects. They are good in their own way, but I gotta say this is probably one of the more confusing aspects of the instrument that I find it hard to feel them. But there is nothing wrong with the effects per se. They do their jobs, but again, you have to turn them on. Like many inbuilt effects, there isn't the space or the thought to think, how do I make these as useful as a real one of these? And they do sound nice, but there are some oddities like how on earth these sound effects work. I have not read the manual. No doubt they have a logic as to how they work, and you can come to terms with them. But I deliberately minimize how much I read manuals because, as I say every time, an instrument should show itself off. It's good design. There is an arpeggiator. Kind of cool. Again, surprisingly similar to what's in Reason. So whether Reason guys have been looking at this, or they looked at Reason, or it's just an inevitability of this is a nice way to do it. There's a whole chord mode which I'm not going to touch. EQ we've looked at. We can turn it on and off here. Oscillator mixers, so we can actually, rather than meddling around clicking here and here and here, pop into a mode where balance our mix. That's actually useful. Mod matrix, which will show you what you've got, and you've got pretty decent control over. I would have to have a look. You don't seem to be able to use the mod matrix to control itself. So creating an assignment like this, modified by, doesn't look to be possible. That's less than ideal. So if I've got this, unless perhaps I use a macro, or maybe there's some way here to assign this to depth here, you've just got to kind of think your way through it, which means that you've now got that assignment, which is really one assignment in usable terms. You've got that spread across 2 or 3 completely different places. So if you do find yourself doing that, you might want to use a mod matrix, and that means planning ahead. So if I wanted my envelope my G envelope to filter one frequency, to be modulated by the mod wheel, then I probably would be best assigning that right from the beginning. Otherwise, I could find that in 3 or 4 different places. It would be a little nicer if they were like Reason has, which is a good way of doing a mod matrix. Source, assignment, modified by. That's a brilliant way of doing it. That covers pretty well everything that we've got. We saw our settings, MIDI stuff, what have you, all pretty good. Keyboard stuff, pretty self-evident. Mono modes, legato modes, portamentos, all works. And access to the chord memory thing. Overview of the synth, nice synth. Sounds really great. Here's something that I prepared earlier. So everything you hear there is Ana, except for the kick, which has come out of Kong. No doubt I could make a kick in Ana, but I just really didn't want to spend the time for a sound that is probably going to end up sounding an awful lot like that. Anyway, it's a sort of ambient electronic Berlin School style piece. So if you're expecting trap, sorry, but I want to show off what the synth would sound like if I were using it, because that's how I'm going to be able to give an opinion on it. And, as I said before, I could make albums with this. It is a nice instrument. Being me, I then sort of thought, what if I go back and compare that to what I'm super useful? So I extracted the MIDI from here, popped it in a new project, and used some Thors and some Europas, and possibly a subtractor as well. As synthesizer, so that's its stock instruments. I ended up making a different kick sound, which seems kind of silly when I could have copied and pasted that one, but so be it. I started again. Wasn't trying to clone the sounds with this, but started again. Well, we'll start with the Ana version. Now, something I noticed a couple of times as I kept coming back was that the Ana version, as I'd ended up with it, seemed over loud and hard and aggressive. I used, seeing I'm doing the Slate thing, I used their Verb Suite Classics, which actually I liked a little better than I anticipated. It's based on impulse responses, and I am not a fan, but it has its charms, its works. If it's come bundled, then you might as well look at it. But it's done its job here. But I also used Fresh Air. Now, I've been asked several times to review it and always declined. And it's done the same thing. Let's listen to just the Arna version. Let's make sure. Yes, it does make things very bright and very forward, but personally, every time I use it, even with low settings, on the spot I might feel like, oh, that's... But I come back and I always feel like, oh, that's hard, it's not brittle. It's unfair to say it's brittle, but it feels hard. It feels a little bit like having nails tapped into you. It's I don't like it. So if we went back and compared the Arna versus the Reason, which does feel warmer, despite the fact that it's Reason, let's see. So this is Arna without Fresh Air. Reason. So, up to you. Of course, Fresh Air, interesting, but can't make my peace with it. Just can't. Bottom line, Arna is a very, very interestingly put together instrument. They've probably put a little bit more care into particularly filter design. So oscillator and filter sound design is exemplary. It really is lovely. Really, really nice instrument. Beautifully designed in terms of the sound. Maybe not quite as beautifully designed in terms of the workflow, but they're coming from a VST environment where having things pop open from what to me feels like random directions is kind of normal. Their way of modulating from here or whatever is good. It does work. But sometimes it's just a little less elegant, so you do want over time to have an understanding. But the more you work with a device like this, the more you just come to accept those things as being perfectly normal. Anyone who spent any period of time is probably going, well, why? This isn't a thing. It's like, because, yeah, you've been using it for so long, you're so used to it that you just automatically deal with it, which is great, and that's exactly what I'm saying will happen, but initially may not. And so if you're finding it that you're a little put off, either give it time or consider in the very short term using the other GUI that just helps you to see the different modules so that you can start to go, well, the purple one runs to the green one, which runs to the white one, which runs to the black one, kind of thing. You know, it's a short-term kind of a crutch, like training wheels. Turn it off as quickly as you can and get to this, or if you prefer one of the dark modes, because that way you will be doing the job better. Effects probably need some coming to terms with, but generally on the whole, I think they do a very good job, so I'm not going to say don't use them, they're garbage. That's not true. Their writing is a little interesting, but once you understand how it works, it does its job just fine. Again, bottom line, it's an instrument that I feel like I could say, okay, that's cool, that's it, and make several albums out of it without feeling like I was running into particular walls, bar some of the things that I've talked about, like some of the less elegant decisions around architecture, modulation, things like that. If you have any questions in general, please note about support for this or Slate, then ask them on down below. As always, we'd ask that you subscribe. By your subscribing, obviously, you get alerted a little sooner as to when there is new material, because if this was interested, maybe the next one will be interesting to you. And also, if you think this is valuable information, seeing subscribers, people ticking the box and interacting with us, tells YouTube's algorithm that we are doing worthwhile work. So it's a nice way of paying back, paying forward, not only to help us, but to help other people get access to the quality of information that we are bringing to you. Benedict for Higher Hertz, and there is higherhertz.com as well with a different stream of information. You have a great day.